woke with a gasp. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, as if he had been running for miles. The room was dark, but the shadows seemed to dance around him, mocking his fear. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Sweat slicked his skin, making his nightshirt cling to his body. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his back, a stark contrast to the heat of his fear. He was in his bed, safe in his room, but the nightmare clung to him like cobwebs. The images were so vivid, so real, that he could almost still feel the oppressive atmosphere of the dream world. The Red Room. It was always the Red Room, the place where his deepest fears manifested, where the walls seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with their crimson hue. It had been so vivid, the crimson wallpaper almost pulsing. The room seemed alive, breathing with a malevolent energy that made his skin crawl. He could almost hear the walls whispering, taunting him with their secrets. In the center of the room she stood, the pale lady, a figure of haunting beauty and terror. Her presence was both alluring and terrifying, drawing him in even as he wanted to flee. The pale lady, she was always there, waiting for him. Her eyes, those black, soulless pits, seemed to see right through him, stripping away his defenses and leaving him exposed. Her face was a mask of white, devoid of color except for the two black pits that were her eyes. They were like voids, pulling him in, making him feel as if he were falling into an endless abyss. They bored into him, filled with a hunger that chilled him to the bone. It was a hunger that seemed to promise something dark and terrible, something he could not escape. Her lips, two slashes of red in that white expanse, moved. They formed words that he could not hear, but he could feel their meaning deep in his soul. "Don't be afraid." The words were a lie, a cruel joke. How could he not be afraid when everything about her screamed danger? She whispered, her voice like rustling paper. It was a sound that sent shivers down his spine, a sound that promised both comfort and doom. "We'll be together soon." The promise hung in the air, a chilling reminder that the nightmare was far from over. He knew that the pale lady would return, and when she did, he would be waiting. Days passed, but the nightmare lingered. Each morning, Charlie woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as if he had just run a marathon. The sun would rise, casting long shadows across his room, but the light brought no comfort. Instead, it seemed to highlight the darkness that clung to him, a constant reminder of the terror that awaited him each night. The image of the pale lady haunted Charlie's waking hours. Her ghostly figure was etched into his mind, an indelible mark that refused to fade. He saw her in every reflective surface, her hollow eyes staring back at him with a chilling intensity. Even in the bustling streets amidst the crowd, he felt her presence, a cold shiver running down his spine. He saw her in the shadows under his bed, heard her whisper in the rustle of leaves outside his window. The nights were the worst, filled with eerie sounds that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind, all carried her voice, a haunting melody that played on repeat in his mind. His once familiar room felt oppressive, the air thick with unseen menace. The walls seemed to close in on him, the ceiling pressing down, making it hard to breathe. Every corner of the room held a shadow, and in every shadow, he saw her face. The room that once was his sanctuary had become a prison, a place where fear reigned supreme. Started sleeping with the lights on, a small island of warmth against the encroaching darkness. The soft glow of the lamp was his only defense, a fragile barrier that kept the nightmares at bay. But even the light couldn't chase away the shadows completely. They lurked at the edges, waiting for the moment when the light would falter. One night, despite the comforting glow, the nightmare returned. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting an eerie glow on the walls. The familiar sense of dread washed over him, and he knew that the pale lady was near. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to dance with a life of their own. He was back in the Red Room. The walls were painted with a deep, unsettling crimson, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. It was a place that existed only in his nightmares, a twisted reflection of his fears. The room pulsed with a malevolent energy, and he could feel it seeping into his very soul. This time, the pale lady was closer. Her presence was overwhelming, a suffocating force that left him paralyzed with fear. Her eyes, dark and empty, bore into his, and he could feel her cold breath on his skin. She reached out a skeletal hand, and he knew that there was no escape. Her long black hair, like a silken shroud, trailed on the floor as she glided towards him. It moved like a living thing, writhing and twisting in the air. The closer she came, the more he felt his strength drain away. Her presence was a black hole, consuming all light and hope. As she reached out to him, he could hear her whisper his name, a chilling promise that this nightmare was far from over. Panic seized Charlie. He scrambled back, his bare feet slipping on the plush carpet. He could feel her presence now, cold and heavy, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. "There's no escape," the pale lady whispered, her voice closer now, a rasp against his ear. "You're mine." He threw himself at the door, his small hands pushing against the unyielding wood. It wouldn't budge. He was trapped. Turning, he saw her standing before him, her face inches from his own. He could feel her breath on his cheek, icy and smelling faintly of decay. Terror lent him strength. Charlie dodged away from the pale lady's outstretched hand, her touch promising something worse than pain. He bolted, his heart a drum in his chest. The red room was gone. He found himself in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were painted a sickly yellow, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed and hummed. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast he ran, the hallway stretched on, seemingly endless, and always, behind him, he could hear her soft, slithering footsteps. "Why are you running? You know you can't hide from me." The pale lady's voice echoed in the hallway, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was haunting, reverberating off the walls and filling the air with an eerie resonance that made Charlie's skin crawl. Her words were laced with a strange sorrow, a longing that chilled him more than any threat. It was as if she was not just a specter of fear, but a soul trapped in an endless cycle of despair, seeking something she had lost long ago. He risked a glance back, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly behind him, shadows dancing in the dim light, playing tricks on his mind. She was closer now, her pale face illuminated by the flickering lights, her black eyes burning with a terrible intensity. The sight of her sent a shiver down his spine, her presence a dark omen that he couldn't shake off. "You can't escape," she whispered, her voice a soft, chilling caress. "You belong with me, forever." Charlie's breath hitched in his throat. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that she was right. The realization hit him like a cold wave, paralyzing him with fear. He couldn't outrun her, he couldn't hide. The walls seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing in from all sides. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but deep down, he knew there was no escape. The pale lady was a part of the shadows, a relentless force that would follow him to the ends of the earth. And as he stumbled through the dark, he could feel her cold breath on the back of his neck, a constant reminder that his fate was sealed. He stumbled into a dead end. A blank wall loomed before him, cutting off his escape. Despair washed over him, cold and numbing. He was trapped. Turning slowly, he faced his pursuer. The pale lady stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, those fathomless black pits, held him captive. "There's nowhere left to run," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but terror had stolen his voice, paralyzed his limbs. He could only watch as she approached, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. The pale lady stopped before him, her face inches from his. He could smell the dust and decay that clung to her, feel the chill that radiated from her body. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, her voice a dry whisper against his cheek. He closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. He felt her cold, dry lips brush against his ear, sending a shiver down his spine. "Let me embrace you," she breathed, her voice a hollow echo in the silence. Her touch was like ice, seeping into his skin, stealing his warmth, his life. I felt myself being drawn towards her, pulled into the depths of her hollow gaze. His fear, his terror began to dissipate, replaced by a strange sense of peace, of inevitability. This was my fate, I realized, to be consumed by the pale lady, to become a part of her darkness. Her arms wrapped around him, a cold, crushing embrace. I felt a sharp, pulling sensation in my gut, as if I were being pulled inside out. Then darkness. The hallway was gone. The pale lady was gone. There was only silence, absolute and complete. It pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating, crushing. I was lost in a void, a black abyss with no beginning and no end. Time had no meaning here. He didn't know how long he drifted in that silent darkness, but it felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, awareness returned. I felt the rough texture of sheets against my skin, the weight of a blanket on my body. Charlie's eyes flew open. I sat up in bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Sweat soaked his pajamas and his heart pounded against his ribs like a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My room was bathed in the soft glow of dawn. I could hear the chirping of birds outside my window, the distant rumble of a garbage truck. It had been a dream, just a dream. But even as he clung to that thought, a shiver of fear ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air in my room felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. And in the shadows, just at the edge of his vision, he could have sworn he saw a flicker of movement. I threw back the covers and scrambled out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. He kept his gaze fixed on the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it truly over, or was this just the beginning? The pale lady's final whisper echoed in the stillness of his mind. "We'll be together soon.